She was cut in half. Not metaphorically, not in the language of tabloid exaggeration. She was directly bisected at the waist level, separated into two clean pieces in a way it looked so surgical and anatomical that when the FBI reviewed the autopsy findings, they told investigators that it's highly possible that the killer had formal medical training. This wasn't a frenzied attack. This wasn't rage. This was someone who knew exactly where to cut and took their time doing it. Her blood was drained from her body. I meant every last drop of it before she was moved. The grass around her was completely dry. The sidewalk was equally clean. She, truth is this, wasn't killed here. She was deliberately delivered here. Both of her body, which was cut into half, were properly arranged and kept 6 inches from the footpath in plain view on a residential street in Los Angeles, like whoever did it wanted an audience. It was 10:50 in the morning that a mother pushing a stroller found her lifeless body. The victim was 22 years old. Her name was Elizabeth Short. And what was done to her body on the night of January 15, 1947, remains officially unsolved. But there is one thing the official record hasn't gotten the nerves to expose, which is the secret voice record.
It took 18 LAPD officers 6 weeks to secretly record their prime suspect inside his own home. 6 weeks of continuous audio surveillance. And what they recorded in those moments are the most traumatizing voice evidence ever in this case, which was,
"Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia. They can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary. She's dead."
That man was never arrested. He left the United States a few months later. He went on with his life, lived freely for another 50 years before he died in 1999. Then, when his family later opened his private photo album after his death, what they found shocked them. A photograph of a woman with her eyes closed and her lipstick smeared so far beyond her lips, it really looked like what was applied by someone else's hand, or applied after she could no longer resist it. Nobody could identify her. For 22 years, she was simply called Jane Doe. Not until 2025, with the emergence of AI, her photograph was scanned using an AI facial recognition system. It scanned that photograph against known images of Elizabeth Short. The match probability came back at 97 to 99%. She was in his album. She was there. And then, if truly that photograph is what the evidence says it is, then the most famous unsolved murder in American history was never unsolved at all. It was just buried. Stay with me, because what happened to Elizabeth Short and what 2025 just revealed about who did it is darker than anything you've been told before.
Before she got her nickname, before the headlines, even before 78 years of books and documentaries and theories of her death, she was just Elizabeth. Elizabeth Short, born July 29, 1924 in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. She was the third daughter of 5 children. Her father disappeared when she was still 6. Out of depression, he staged his own death and abandoned his family to his poor wife alone to raise 5 girls in a country that had just financially collapsed. She grew up learning that the people who were supposed to stay left. By the time she hit early 20s, she had already lived in Florida, Massachusetts, and California. She was constantly moving. She did work as waitresses, also worked in army-base canteens, a string of rented rooms in cities that never quite became home. She was very easy to be identified by every predator in that era because of her charming and beautiful looks, and she was completely unanchored. She arrived in Los Angeles for the last time in July 1946. For the next 6 months, she moved through the city like a woman who was running out of options.
She had different addresses, gave different names to different men. She was headlined promiscuous and unstable by newspaper companies after she died. They would imply she earned what happened to her. She was only 22 years old, a poor trying to survive in a city that ate people like her for breakfast. What happened to her was not a consequence of who she was. It was a consequence of who he was. The question remains this: what was actually done to her?
Because most accounts remove sensitive angles to this, and you need to understand the full picture to understand what kind of person committed this crime. On the early morning of January 15, 1947, Elizabeth Short's body was found lifeless on South Norton Avenue in the Libert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. She had been bisected at the waist, cut completely in half, with what the lead detective, Harry Hansen, testified before a grand jury was the skill of, his exact words, a very fine surgeon. Every drop of blood had been drained out of her body. The FBI and medical examiners concluded she had been suspended upside down after death to allow complete drainage, a process that takes hours. Her skin had been scrubbed and washed clean with gasoline. There were marks of rope on her wrists and ankles, which suggests she had been bound while still alive. There were cigarette burns, 8 or 9 of them, across her back. Her mouth had been cut open at both corners. It was extended from her natural lip line toward her ears, what journalists would call a Glasgow smile. Fecal matter was found in her stomach, and this tells us that she had been forced to consume it right before she was murdered. Her body had then been carefully posed, positioned, and left in public to attract a scene. Whoever did this did it with a deliberateness that investigators immediately recognized as the signature of someone who had done this before, or had planned it so thoroughly for months that it might as well have been rehearsal. The Los Angeles Examiner received a manila envelope in the mail 10 days after the murder. The mail included a letter using cut-out newspaper words saying, "Here is Dahlia's belongings." Inside was Elizabeth Short's birth certificate, her business cards, names and addresses on scraps of paper, her address book with one page torn out. Every item had been wiped completely clean of fingerprints, except one. One partial print survived. But something unexpected happened. It was never matched. It has never been matched. A total of 150 suspects were investigated. The FBI ran a thorough nationwide checks. Medical schools were canvassed. Army records were pulled. And through it all, 2 names kept surfacing. 2 men whose connections to Elizabeth Short, whose behavior after her death, and whose documented lies to investigators made them the LAPD's most persistent persons of interest. So who are these 2 men? The first man built a house that looked like a mouth. The second man put her on a bus and then lied about every hour they had spent together. If you designed a suspect from scratch, assembled every quality that this evidence demanded, you would end up with only one name: George Hodel. He was born in 1907. By the time he was a teenager, he had been tested with a high IQ of 186, placing him in the highest measurable fraction of human intelligence. He became a physician. After a while, he became the head of the Los Angeles County Venereal Disease Clinic, which, in the 1940s in Los Angeles, it meant he had intimate, confidential knowledge of the most powerful and most compromised people in the city. Politicians, judges, police brass, anyone who had ever needed his professional discretion owed him something. He built his practice, he built his reputation, and he built his house. The Sowden House, which was later renamed the Franklin House, was designed by Lloyd Wright, son of Frank Lloyd Wright. It sits in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles, and it looks from the street like a face with its mouth open. a Mayan-influenced concrete structure with an entrance that multiple visitors have described independently as a feeling like you are being swallowed alive. Inside, Hodel hosted gatherings that drew a lot of Hollywood's inner circle.
The host certainly is hiding. I am only here for the photos.
Delightful champagne, isn't it?
Screenwriters, directors, surrealist artists. From many angles, the atmosphere was one of deliberate transgression. Those who attended later recalled George Hodel enjoyed making people afraid of him. George Hodel was later accused of rape in 1949 by his teenage daughter Tamar. 3 witnesses corroborated her account. However, Hodel didn't accept defeat. He hired the most powerful criminal defense attorney in Los Angeles, called in every political favor the city owed him, and was acquitted. During the trial, an accusation from Tamar was brought up by the defense to discredit Tamar as a pathological liar. It emerged that she had told people her father was the one who killed the Black Dahlia. The jury heard it, the judge heard it, and the LAPD heard it. By 1950, they had assembled an 18-man surveillance team and wired Hodel's house for continuous audio monitoring. What they recorded over the following 6 weeks became the foundation of what the district attorney's office would privately conclude but never publicly act on. The recording of Hodel saying,
Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia. They can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary. She's dead.
is real. It exists. It is part of the documented record that Steve Hodel, George's son, a retired LAPD homicide detective, obtained and published. But wait, the recording wasn't the only evidence.
Receipts connected to Hodel's property showed the purchase of 50-pound sacks of cement and fertilizer within 2 days of the murder. The cadaver dogs that were brought to the Sowden house decades later alerted to human decomposition in the basement and surrounding grounds. Multiple witnesses from people who knew both Hodel and Short told investigators that the two of them have always been so close, if not lovers. The DA's own files, obtained by Steve Hodel, contain a notation confirming that a lieutenant with the name Frank Jemison had documented that George Hodel knew and had dated Elizabeth Short in 1946. They were connected. The evidence connected them. The surveillance connected him to the confession. And yet, no arrest was made. A few years after this solid evidence emerged against him, George Hodel fled the United States in March 1950. He spent the next 4 decades in the Philippines and Asia, though he returned to San Francisco in his final years. He died in 1999 as a free man, wealthy, professionally decorated. His family found the photo album. And in November 2025, after Steve Hodel submitted the unidentified woman's photograph for modern forensic facial analysis, the result came back. 97 to 99% match probability to Elizabeth Short. Not 60%, not a possible resemblance. 97 to 99%. With analysts noting that all primary facial landmarks aligned with near-perfect consistency. The residual 1 to 3% uncertainty was attributed solely to image noise and resolution degradation in a 1940s photograph. A separate AI system returned 85 to 90% on the first independent pass. A German facial recognition laboratory had previously assessed the same image at 95%.
3 systems, 3 independent analyses, all returning and still pointing the same identity. And the detail about the lipstick, the smearing, the extension beyond the natural lip line in every direction. Forensic analysts who examined the image noted it was consistent with application by an external hand, or application to a subject who was unconscious, or application to a subject who was already dead. George Hodel photographed women with their eyes closed and their arms raised above their heads, a pose Steve Hodel later identified as a distorted interpretation of surrealist imagery. Multiple photographs of this type exist in the album. The Jane Doe photograph fits the pattern exactly. If she is Elizabeth Short, and the AI says she almost certainly is, then at some time, maybe before her body was arranged on that sidewalk, George Hodel looked at her through a camera lens, took a shot, and then he closed the album. And then he left the country. Now the name you have never heard before, Carl Balsiger. This name appears in nearly every serious account of the Black Dahlia case, briefly, in passing, as a footnote in a list of men who knew Elizabeth Short, and who also was known to have been behaving suspiciously afterward. A name came up that naturally disappeared without anyone ever fully pulling on the thread.
In 2025, Emmy-nominated documentary producer Eli Frankel pulled on it for 5 years and published what he found in a book called Sisters in Death. Here's what is documented and not in dispute. Carl Balsiger was a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army. He and Elizabeth Short had known each other since at least 1943. They have repeatedly overlapped at Camp Cook, California, where he was a company commander and she was working at the base PX. They were not strangers. They had a history together. 1 month before her body was found, in December 1946, something shifted in Elizabeth Short's behavior. Witnesses who knew her in Los Angeles described her as frightened, moving urgently, trying to leave the city in a way that went beyond her usual restlessness. Before she was found dead, she spent 3 days with Carl Balsiger. He drove her to Camarillo. He housed her overnight. He took her back to Los Angeles. He drove her to the Hollywood bus station and watched her board a bus to San Diego. That was it. That was exactly what he told the police, and he also added he never saw her again as his final words.
But when detectives pressed him, when they asked him to account for the specific hours of those 3 days, his story changed. Dates shifted. The sequence of events he described contradicted itself in ways that experienced homicide investigators recognized immediately as the construction of a false narrative rather than the recall of a true one. He was never cleared. The LAPD kept Carl Balsiger on their active suspect list for 7 years after Elizabeth Short's murder, longer than nearly any other person connected to the case. As things got serious, Frankel's research surfaced something the LAPD had known for a long time but never fully pursued. It was a connection to another murder 6 years earlier, 1,600 miles away. A woman named Layla Welsh, found in her bedroom in Kansas City, Missouri, in March 1941, with mutilations that investigators who later reviewed both cases described as strikingly similar to what was done to Elizabeth Short. Carl Balsiger had ties to Kansas City. The LAPD requested the Welsh murder file from Kansas City Police. Due to miscommunication, a bureaucratic failure so mundane it is almost unbearable to contemplate given what was at stake, the file never arrived. Now this is what Frankel concluded. Had it been that file was transferred successfully, Balsiger would have become the primary suspect. The case might have been solved in 1947. Now, I will be transparent with you, as I always have been. Frankel's theory has been challenged. Another researcher who obtained Balsiger's military service records argues that his duty station assignments created problems related to his timeline for the Kansas City connection. That challenge is real, and you deserve to know it exists.
But here is what no challenge touches. First of all, Balsiger's documented connection to Short in her final weeks was absolutely real. Secondly, his inconsistent statements to police were real. Thirdly, his 7 years on the LAPD's active suspect list, also real. Last but not the least, the failed file transfer that may have cost investigators the break they needed was equally real. And there is one more thing Frankel uncovered that no challenge can touch, because it came directly from the woman who found Elizabeth Short's body. Guess what? A lead detective named Harry Hansen revealed something before he died. He had kept this secret weapon back from the public since January 1947. He said there's a standard investigative practice: withhold one detail from every crime scene that only the killer would know. Use it to filter out false confessors. Use it to test suspects in interrogation. He called it the key question. It was not related to the mutilations of the body. Neither was it related to the bisection or the drainage of blood or the wounds. However, Hansen said in his own words, it was related to the condition, appearance, or attitude of Elizabeth Short's body at the moment Betty Bersinger found it on that sidewalk.
Something about how she looked, something observable, something that every journalist, every detective, every curious citizen who had seen the crime scene photographs had looked directly at and missed. Over the years of investigation, detectives have asked this the key question to more than 500 people. Not even one person answered correctly. Hansen said the specificity was so extreme, so remote from anything a person could arrive at by logic or guesswork, that answering it correctly was functionally impossible unless you had been there. Unfortunately, he took the answer to his grave. For 78 years, it stayed there. Then, Eli Frankel found Betty Bersinger, the woman who discovered the body, the woman who had given her account to journalists and investigators and documentary crews for 8 decades, with the same account, always the same details, and still stopping at the same place. This time, Frankel pushed past that place. He asked her about specific details which she had never been asked about directly. And Betty Bersinger, nearly 80 years after she walked past that vacant lot with her 3-year-old daughter, told him something she had never told anyone publicly before. A frightening detail about the crime scene. Something she saw, something that had never appeared in any book, any documentary, any police report made available to the public. Frankel believes it is the key question, or the answer to it. He published it in Sisters in Death.
I'm not going to tell you.
Not because I want to withhold it, but because what Frankel described deserves to be read in full context, and because reducing it to a single sentence here would strip it of the weight it carries. Please endure with me. What I will tell you is this. Whatever Betty Bersinger observed on that sidewalk in 1947, whatever the key question actually was, it does not point toward any sort of accident. Neither does it point toward impulse or panic or a killer who lost control. It points toward someone who spent considerable time with Elizabeth Short's body after her death. A person who was deliberate, someone who arranged what they left behind with the cold, methodical patience of a person who had thought about this possibly for a long time before they did it. That is not the profile of a stranger. It is equally not the profile of impulse. That is the profile of someone with high IQ who knew exactly what they were doing, and who knew, when they were finished, exactly how to disappear. All right, so here is the question nobody has ever thought of asking. Not in 78 years of books written on this case, not in any documentary, not in any investigation. What if both men are part of the same story? Think about it. December 1946. Elizabeth Short spends 3 days alone with Carl Balsiger, a soldier she has known since 1943. He houses her, he drives her, he puts her on a bus to San Diego, and he lies about every hour of it afterward. That is the same December window, the same 6 to 8 weeks that George Hodel and Elizabeth Short are documented to have been seeing each other. They overlapped. She was seeing both men at the same time in the same city. Now think about who George Hodel was. He saw women as trophies to possess, violent and possessive. They existed for his enjoyment only, mere objects of artistic and carnal desire. He was already running multiple women simultaneously, 2 wives, a common law wife, rotating flings, all still under his control, all in the same orbit. Yet they kept coming. A man like that can have every woman in Los Angeles, but not one of them is allowed to have someone else. That is not contradiction, that is the defining logic of a controller. The rules exist for everyone except him. Loyalty is demanded from all directions, and when it breaks, when one woman steps outside the boundary he drew around her without her consent, the response is not grief, it is punishment. At 16, George Hodel was expelled from university for having an affair with his professor's wife. He got her pregnant. His entire adult life was built on taking what belonged to other men. But when another man took what he considered his, that was a different calculation entirely. He ran a venereal disease clinic at the center of Los Angeles' social power. He knew everyone's secrets. He had the entire network of 1940s Hollywood feeding him information in exchange for his discretion. A woman in his intimate circle spending 3 days alone with a soldier in a city where Hodel's reach extended into every corner. I personally don't think that kind of secret stays hidden. So here is the theory the evidence builds. Hodel finds out about Balsiger, not as a betrayal that breaks his heart. Controllers don't break, they calculate. What he feels is not heartbreak, it is the specific cold fury of a man who believes he owns something and has just discovered it moved without his permission. Then Elizabeth Short comes back to Los Angeles on January 9th, 1947. She has 5 days left to live. Now look at what was done to her body. The bisection, performed with surgical precision by someone with formal anatomical training. The organs removed and repositioned deliberately beneath her. The Glasgow smile carved into her face. The cigarette burns across her back. The body scrubbed clean, transported, posed 6 inches from a public sidewalk for maximum exposure, like a display in a gallery window. That is not the work of a stranger. Strangers don't stage. Strangers don't scrub. Strangers don't spend hours arranging what they leave behind. Steve Hodel said it himself. Elizabeth's body was my father's canvas. His scalpel was the paintbrush. The crime scene bore a striking resemblance to 2 specific surrealist artworks by Man Ray, a close Hodel family friend and regular at the Sowden House parties. A controller who is also a surgeon, who is also a surrealist, who has just discovered that a woman he considered his property spent 3 days alone with another man. He doesn't just kill her, he turns her into something. He makes the punishment a performance, staged for the city he lived in, the police he despised, and the audience he knew would come. This humiliation built into every detail of that crime scene, the positioning, the cuts, the public display. Forensic criminologists call it anger retaliatory staging. It is the mark of a killer who knew his victim personally, who felt ownership over her, who needed the world to see what happens when that ownership is violated. A controller doesn't just kill what he can't control, he makes sure nobody else can ever have it either. That is our theory, built from extensive research. The evidence does not prove it as fact, but it explains the crime scene in a way nothing else does. The surgical precision combined with the deliberate humiliation, the cold calculation combined with the personal rage written into every cut. 2 men, 1 woman, a December nobody fully accounted for, and a body posed on a sidewalk that looked less like a murder and more like a verdict.